They brought him into town tied behind a mule, not even bothering to clean the blood off his face. His feet dragged in the dirt, one boot missing, the other barely hanging on by its laces. Children stopped playing. Women stepped off porches. Men narrowed their eyes, but no one, not one soul, stepped forward to ask why a man who looked like he'd wrestled a bear was being led like a dog. The shock wasn't just in the chain, it was in the way he looked back. Eyes swollen, lips split, nose bent, but his gaze didn't flicker, didn't dodge, didn't ask for mercy. It burned, even through the grime, like coals that refused to die, even when buried under snow. The crowd whispered. He killed 3 marshals, lived up in the ridge without clothes, drinks wolf blood and eats raw meat, doesn't speak English, all of them wrong, except one too wild. He's not fit for people. The sheriff pulled him to the center of town where the old gallows used to stand before they built the auction block. They didn't hang men anymore, they sold them. And that made it worse. The block still smelled like heat and humiliation. The sheriff spat, kicked his knees from behind, toe down. But the mountain man didn't go down. His body shook, but he stayed standing, knees trembling, spine like timber that hadn't cracked yet. And that was when something strange happened. He smiled, not a smirk, not defiance, something older. Like he'd seen this before in another lifetime, and already knew how it would end. That's when she noticed the wolf. It was carved into a thin slice of bone tied to a leather cord around his neck, mud-covered, almost hidden. A wolf, lying down, not attacking, not running, just still. The sheriff yanked it off, tossed it into the dirt. The crowd flinched when the mountain man roared. It wasn't human. It came from a deeper place, the ribs, maybe, or the years. 2 deputies tackled him. Another drew a pistol, and still. He never bowed. From her window above the general store, the widow watched it unfold. She hadn't come to town for this. She'd come for nails and coffee. She hadn't spoken to another soul in days. Her black dress, now faded to gray, hung off her thin shoulders. Dust clung to her hem. She hadn't expected the sound of his cry to break something in her chest. She hadn't expected the silence that followed it to feel like her own. They chained him to the post beside the auction block. Let the sun cook his back. 2 boys threw stones. He didn't blink. A man laughed. Someone kicked the wolf carving into the trough. Won't last a day. Someone muttered. Should have hung him, said another. The auctioneer stood on the block, squinting at the paper. Property of the Territorial Army. 1 male, presumed 30. No known name. High resistance to heat and pain. Not housebroken. The crowd laughed. That's when the auctioneer said at minimum bid 2 silver eagles, guaranteed untamed. She didn't know why her heart leapt. She hated auctions. They reminded her of her husband's last breath, the rasp of air. The way his hand tried to reach her but couldn't. He used to say, don't look at pain like it's a stranger. It's a neighbor that visits us all. She looked down at the man on the post, and for one heartbeat he looked up, not at the crowd, at her window, straight through it, into her. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't even human, really. It was recognition. He saw something in her. And damn it, she saw something in him. A flicker, maybe madness, maybe memory. Maybe a man who used to believe in something. Once, before the wild carved it out of him. The auctioneer started the bid. No one raised a hand. No one wanted a mad wolf in their shed. 2 eagles, 1.5. Anyone. The widow looked down at her hands, calloused, thin. She hadn't touched another human being since the funeral. She thought of the nights of the silence so thick it made her ears ring. Of the way the bed dipped on only one side. Of the damn wind always knocking against the shutters like it was asking for something. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe because he didn't bow. Maybe because she didn't want to be the kind of person who looked away. She stepped out onto the balcony and lifted her hand. The entire square fell silent. The widow had spoken once more. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. The auctioneer stuttered. The sheriff laughed, but it sounded nervous. "You don't know what you're buying, ma'am." She didn't answer. She just descended the stairs one step at a time and walked into the heat. The mountain man didn't smile, but for the briefest moment, he lowered his eyes, not in defeat, in something else, as if to say, "You saw me." As she reaches him, the wind shifts and the little carved wolf bobs gently in the trough, floating between them like a forgotten memory neither of them knows how to claim. They gave her the chain, not a key, not an escort, just the rusted chain that bound his wrists crusted with blood and road dust. The auctioneer tipped his hat, half amused, half wary, and said, "He's yours now, ma'am. No refunds if he bites." She didn't answer. She simply took the chain in both hands, thin fingers wrapped around iron, and turned away from the crowd. The mountain man didn't move. For one long, strange second, he stood rooted like a tree that had never known a path. His face was unreadable. There was no gratitude, no resistance, just his presence was heavy, like a storm hanging over dry grass. And then, finally, he stepped, behind her, no shoes, no words, just the crunch of boots hers and the bare scrape of his soles on sand and stone, a sound that echoed down Main Street, drawing stares from doorways and shaded porches. The townsfolk watched, whispering, shaking heads, as the widow led the wild man out of town like a woman walking her own execution. She didn't look back, not once, not even when a boy hissed a slur or a man spat near her skirt. The townspeople weren't angry, not really. They were confused, as if someone had taken the script and burned it in front of them. Women didn't do this. Widows didn't buy men. And they damn sure didn't choose the ones who refused to bow. They crossed the dry creek bed by dusk, the horizon bleeding orange behind the hills. Her small cabin waited at the edge of the cottonwoods, where the wind rustled branches like old bones. She kept walking until the boards of the porch creaked underfoot. He didn't stop at the steps, not until she turned. Then he stood there silent, unmoving, the chain slack between them. She could have unlatched it, could have invited him in, but she waited, a test neither of them understood. The mountain man raised his hands, slow as dawn, and dropped the chain on her porch, then stepped back, 2 paces, no more. She bent down, picked up the chain, and carried it inside. That night, she didn't sleep, not because she feared him, but because something in her had been stirred awake, a presence outside the cabin, quiet and watchful. He hadn't moved from the tree he chose, 20 feet from her porch, his back against the bark, knees drawn up, arms folded over them. She lit a single oil lamp and watched him through the window. He watched the stars, and she watched him. In the glow of the lantern, she saw the outline of his body, battered, scarred, but not broken. There was a language in those scars. She just didn't know how to read it yet. The next morning, she left the door open, just wide enough. She made coffee, toasted dry cornbread on the cast iron stove, let the smell drift outside. Still, he didn't come. By noon, she took a cup, no sugar, no milk, and placed it on the porch rail. When she came back out at dusk, the cup was empty. That was the start. They spoke no words. Not then. Days passed, stitched together by the creak of floorboards, the scrape of a shovel, the rhythm of firewood splitting against a stump. He never entered uninvited. She never invited him. Yet every day, he came closer. One night, it rained. The real kind, cold, fat drops hammering the tin roof, soaking the soil, awakening the pine smell in the air. She lit the lantern, opened the door, and this time he stepped in, wet, shivering, dripping mud and smoke. His bare feet left dark prints on her floorboards, but she didn't flinch. She offered a towel. He took it without a word, eyes lowered, but just before he turned to the hearth, he reached into his pocket and placed something on her table. The carved wolf, soggy leather cord, splintered tail, still lying down. She didn't touch it, not yet. Instead, She lit a second lantern, one for her side of the room, one for his, and the two flickered between them like halves of a single fire that had been split by time. As the storm howled outside and the wolf carving sat quietly between them, a drip of water from his hair hit the wooden floor and she saw her own reflection ripple there, not whole, not shattered, just finally seen. She boiled water like it mattered, not for tea, not for show, but with purpose, slow and steady. Fire tucked just right under the black iron kettle, steam rising like breath from a tired horse. He watched her from the hearth, his body wrapped in an old quilt, the corners barely touched, not because it was small, but because his frame had been built by hunger and wildness both. She didn't speak as she carried the basin to the table, didn't ask his name, didn't flinch at the sight of his scars. She dipped the cloth, wrung it out slow, then set it against his temple with the kind of touch reserved for things too fragile to last long in this world. He winced, but not from pain, from surprise, as if her tenderness burned more than the wounds ever had. She wiped the dried blood from his cheek, the dirt from his jaw. His skin, beneath the layers, was tanned deep, weathered by sun and solitude, a face chiseled by storms. But it wasn't monstrous, just unpracticed at being seen. A streak of old bruising trailed from his ear to his collarbone. Her hand hovered there, his breath caught, shallow in his chest. Then he shifted away, not violently, like a deer backing one step into the trees. She nodded, no words, just respect. She turned back to the stove. Silence returned, but not the empty kind. This was a silence thick with recognition, like the first pause between strangers who might just share the same ghost. The next morning, she found her chopping stump split clean down the middle. Not broken, sharpened. He'd split a week's worth of logs and stacked them by size, aligned to the edge of the porch with a precision that felt ceremonial. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect it. But when she handed him a bowl of hot stew that evening, something passed between them. Not a smile, not yet, but a loosening of the shoulders, a softening around the eyes. That night, as he slept by the fire, she reached for the wolf. It was dry now. The cord still frayed, the carving crude, but something in it called her. The way its legs were tucked beneath it, the way its head wasn't raised in aggression, nor lowered in fear, just resting. She held it in her palm for a long while. The firelight danced across the surface, casting a long shadow on the wall, one that almost looked like movement. She thought of her husband, of the last time he laid still in their bed, breath thin, hands too cold. He hadn't said goodbye, just whispered something so soft she wasn't sure it was meant for her. Don't tame the parts of you that survived. She didn't know why that line returned now, after all this time. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the mountain man stirred in his sleep, murmuring something in a language she didn't recognize. Not words, just sounds. Old, maybe, or made up, the way children speak to dreams. By the fifth morning, he started bringing things back from the woods. Not hunted meat, but small things. Birch bark curls, an arrowhead, a sprig of wild mint, a bundle of moss knotted with pine twine. He placed them quietly on the porch rail each day, then sat at the edge of the steps. Carving, always carving, never looking at her directly, but never leaving. She realized, after a week, what he was doing, replacing the wolf. Each one started as a piece of branch or bone, but none were finished. It was as if he were waiting for something. One evening, she brought her rocking chair out to the porch, set it beside his place. Didn't ask, didn't explain. He looked at it, then at her, and for the first time nodded. She sat beside him in the twilight, two figures on a weather-worn porch surrounded by half-finished wolves and quiet fireflies. She thought of how the world would see this. A woman too long alone, a man too wild to name. But here, in the hush between them, there was no judgment, no past. Only the slow dance of healing that didn't ask questions or rush the steps. As the last light of dusk faded, he handed her the carving in progress unfinished, but further along than any before, and as her fingers curled around it, his hand lingered just a second too long, as if asking, "Do you want to know who I was?" The carving was smooth in her hand. Not perfect, he never sanded the wood, but deliberate. The lines of the wolf's spine were sharper now, its head tilted slightly up, no longer resting. Not aggressive, not submissive, just aware. She turned it over slowly, feeling the notches beneath the paws almost like scars. When she looked up, he wasn't on the porch anymore. She found him behind the cabin, kneeling at the base of a split pine, shirtless in the cold, rubbing charcoal between his fingers, painting something on the bark. His movements were trance-like, slow, ritualistic. When he noticed her, he didn't flinch this time, just nodded once, then returned to the tree. The image took shape, a crude but unmistakable form of a young boy cradling a wolf cub. The boy's eyes, just two black dabs of ash, seemed to watch her. She stood beside him now, close enough to hear his breath. Still he didn't speak, not until the last mark was drawn. Then, voice rough with rust and memory, he said, "They found us in winter." She didn't move, just listened. He kept painting. I was 6, maybe 7, or snow as tall as me. My father had already gone, left or died, we didn't know. He paused. My mother, she sang to keep the cold away, hummed into the bark of trees like they'd remember it. Another breath, shaky this time. Then they came, men with wet boots, white eyes, took everything, burned what they didn't understand. He pressed the charcoal hard now, cracking it in half. I ran, found the cub half dead by the creek, raised it, named him Kilo. The name hung in the air. Kilo slept on my chest, taught me how to listen, how to stop running. She looked at the image again. "But wolves don't stay," he said, eyes distant. He left, came back with a hole in his side. I buried him with the antlers he liked to chew on. His voice thinned. I carved him, again and again, never got it right. She stepped forward, close enough to touch the back of his shoulder, but didn't. He continued. After that, I stayed out there. Ridge country. Lived on snow and roots, until I killed a man who shouldn't have been near that child. Her breath caught. He was hurting her. I stopped him. The silence stretched. The law don't care why. He stood now, taller than she remembered. Don't know how long they hunted me. Thought maybe it'd be a clean shot to the back. His gaze softened, but they chained me. They stared at each other for a moment, two people who had been broken by different silences. Then he said it. "I didn't expect you to raise your hand." It was the first time he spoke about that moment. She looked away. Neither of them noticed her hands had curled into fists. Then softly, as if daring the wind to carry it away, he said, "You raised your hand the same way he used to." She turned, startled. He clarified, "Your husband." Her blood chilled. "How would you know that?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He nodded toward the wolf carving she held. "I saw him once, up near Dawson Ridge. Gave me food, shared fire, told me about you." He paused, then added, he said, "She doesn't speak much, but when she raises her hand, it's already decided." Her knees almost buckled. That line, that was what her husband had said to her when he first proposed. No one else knew. No one. She sat down hard on the porch step, clutching the carving to her chest. He stood beside her, quiet as a shadow. "I didn't know he'd passed," he said, low. She nodded, eyes wet. "He died in winter." They sat like that for a long while. Two wolves who had known too many winters. That night, she placed the carving beside her bed, not in a drawer, not hidden, right on the windowsill where it caught the moonlight just right. In the stillness before sleep, her fingers traced the curves of the carving one last time, and just as her eyes closed, she whispered into the dark. Maybe the wolf didn't run. Maybe he waited. Unbeknownst to her, outside the window, he was sitting beneath the tree awake, and listening. By the first thaw, they were no longer strangers. They still didn't say much, not in town, not on the porch, but the way they moved told the truth louder than any sermon. She set out 2 cups instead of 1. He began sleeping on the floor near the hearth instead of outside. His shoulders dropped when she entered a room. Her hands didn't tremble when she reached for his. And the carving. The wolf was no longer alone. He had begun shaping a second one, smaller, curled beside the first. The figures sat together now on the mantel. Never touched, but never apart. The town noticed. Of course they did. Whispers started in the pews and under the breath of shopkeepers. A woman buying bread asked, "Ain't she still in mourning?" Someone at the blacksmith muttered, "Can't tame a dog like that. He'll turn on her." By the time spring came, the whisper turned to teeth. The preacher's wife showed up on her porch with a tin of biscuits and 2 sweet eyes. "It's none of our business," she said. "But folks are watching." The widow didn't answer. She just closed the door. The mountain man heard it all. He said nothing. But that night, he sat by the fire longer than usual, staring at the wolves. Then he began carving a third. It wasn't a wolf, it was a hand, outstretched, open, shaking. The next day he went into town, alone. She warned him not to, but he did. And he walked like someone who knew what pain would come, and chose it anyway. They saw him at the general store, getting nails. They saw him leave coins for a man with a limp, and hand a tin of beans to a starving child. He said nothing, but those gestures were loud enough to split glass. The sheriff cornered him outside the livery. "You think you're forgiven?" he sneered. "You think we forgot what you are?" The mountain man just looked at him, and then he bowed, not in submission, in acknowledgement. A gesture older than pride, and that was worse. The sheriff shoved him, called him names. He took it, all of it, then walked away. Back home. He handed her the bag of nails. His knuckles were bleeding, and she didn't ask why. She just took his hand, wrapped it in cloth, and whispered, "You don't have to fight them." But the fire in his eyes told her something else. He wouldn't fight for himself, but he would fight for her. 3 nights later, they came. 5 men, masked, drunk, riding horses that kicked up her vegetable garden. One shouted, "Time to send the animal back to the wild." Another, laughing, poured lamp oil on the barn wall. The mountain man stepped out before they reached the door, shirtless, unarmed. The fire crackled on the dry wood behind him, then exploded upward. She screamed, but he didn't run. He ran toward it, toward the flames, toward the horses, toward the men. One tried to strike him with a pistol. He took the blow to the jaw and didn't fall. Instead, he grabbed the man by the collar and dragged him off the saddle, landing a punch that sounded like a tree splitting. Another tried to draw a rifle. The mountain man kicked the weapon, sending it spinning into the dark. The others scattered. The barn roared. He turned to it, eyes wild, lungs heaving, and bolted into the smoke. She screamed again, "He's going to die." But moments later he came out, holding her goat, cradled like a child, soot-covered, coughing, limping, but smiling. The first smile she'd ever seen on his face. A boyish, ridiculous, soot-streaked grin. She ran to him, helped him down, wrapped his arms over her shoulder, and sighed. After pouring water over his back and laying him down near the hearth, she reached into his hand to find something clenched in his fist. It wasn't a weapon. It was the third carving. The hand, blackened now, scorched, but still whole, as she wiped his face with her sleeve. His lips cracked open, voice barely a breath. "Your husband said, you boiled water like it mattered." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She just whispered back, "It still does." He could have fled. The fire had given him an open path, smoke covering his tracks. The town distracted, eyes turned inward in gossip and shame. He could have vanished into the ridge again, lived off moss and snow and silence. But he didn't. He stayed, even when the sheriff came to the cabin the next morning. bruised pride under a silver star, dragging the preacher and 2 deputies behind him. He stayed. The widow stepped out first, hair undone, dress singed at the hem, hands still stained with ash. The sheriff didn't look at her. He looked at the man who stood beside her. Not behind. Beside. Word is you assaulted 3 citizens. The mountain man said nothing. The preacher cleared his throat. This is a Christian town. Folks are afraid. She cut him off. And you mean angry? The preacher faltered. Ma'am. But her voice was cold steel now. You let 5 men burn my barn. If he hadn't stopped them, I'd be in a box, like my husband. The sheriff stepped forward. You harbor him, you'll be judged the same. The mountain man moved then slow, deliberate. He reached down to the porch rail and handed her the wolf carving, then turned to the sheriff. I'll go. His voice was calm, low. I'll go, if she asks me to. The air turned still. Even the birds quieted. The widow looked down at the carving now warm from his hand, then at the man who had walked through fire to protect her goat, who had let a child beat his chest with tiny fists at the general store just 2 days ago. Not in anger, but in wonder, who had listened when no one else had spoken her late husband's name in months. She stepped between them. If he goes, I go. The sheriff blinked. The preacher gasped. She added, We'll take the ridge, leave this town to its shame. The silence stretched. The mountain man didn't touch her, but she could feel his breath slow, as if something loosened in him. The sheriff grunted. You'll regret it. She didn't answer. They didn't return that day, nor the next. But over the next week, something began to change. The widow and the wild man started rebuilding the barn. Together, no hired hands, no donations, just hammer and sweat, ash and timber. She caught him smiling only once when the goat head butted the door frame and nearly knocked itself unconscious. They laughed. Together. The townspeople kept their distance, but some watched from afar. One girl left a basket of apples on the gate. No note. No name. He carved one of them into a new symbol. A wolf pup standing between 2 larger wolves, its tail raised in defiance. He handed it to the widow the next morning. And for the first time, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his cheek. No declaration, just warmth, acknowledgement. She whispered, You're not what they say. He whispered back, Neither are you. They sat on the porch that evening as the light died, her head resting against his shoulder. No kiss, just nearness. 2 people who had earned silence the hard way and were finally safe in it. But as the moon rose, he stirred, got up, walked to the old fire pit. She followed. He pulled a bundle from beneath the logs, opened it. Inside were his old clothes, matted fur, torn leather, blood-soaked wool, the life he had carried on his back for years. He dropped it into the flames, watched it curl and blacken. She touched his hand. What now? He didn't answer, just watched the last thread burn. Then said, Now I start over. She handed him a blanket. He didn't need it, but he took it anyway. As they stood by the fire, embers rising into the stars, he whispered again, barely audible over the wind, I see the ridge in your eyes. She turned to him and said, And I see home in yours. It started with a feather, not a real one, but a carving. He placed it on her workbench one morning, nestled between shavings of cedar and curls of birch. It was delicate, impossibly so, every barb etched with care, the quill slightly bent, as if caught mid-fall. She touched it with reverence, then she picked up her knife. For the first time in 3 winters, she began to carve again. Not furniture, not fence posts, but something else, something alive. She chose a piece of white pine, light, soft, forgiving, and she carved a wolf, not like his. This one stood tall, head tilted to the sky, not howling, just listening. Beside it, she shaped another smaller rounder, curled beside the first, tail tucked under. Her hand trembled as she made the final stroke. She'd carved the second wolf in her own likeness, not in form, but in posture. It was the way she used to sit, legs folded beneath her, waiting for her husband to come home. But this time, the waiting was over. She carried the finished carving to the windowsill, placed it beside his. Now there were three wolves, one resting, one listening, one standing watch. That night, she tied her hair back and swept the floor, lit both lanterns, cooked extra beans. He didn't speak when he entered, but he noticed. She saw the way his eyes moved not to the food or the table, but to her hands. He nodded once, sat down. They ate quietly, until she asked, "What was your real name?" He paused, then smiled. "I don't remember," he said, "but I know what he used to call me." She tilted her head. "Your father." He shook his head. "No." "Your husband." She froze. He continued, voice barely above the wind outside. "He called me Ridge, said it was the kind of name a man earned after losing everything, then choosing to come back anyway." Her breath caught. That was the same name her husband had once etched into the back of a chair. Ridge. She had thought it meant the place where they met. Now, maybe it meant more. She whispered, "Then Ridge it is." He looked at her. Not just with eyes, but with something deeper. Gratitude, recognition, maybe even love. And then he said it. The words that stopped her heart, that no one else had ever known, that only one man had whispered into her ear in the final hours of his life. He said, "When the wind comes, tie nothing down. Let it find you brave." She dropped her spoon, looked at him. Tears filled her eyes, not from pain, from something older. Memory. Connection. He saw it, waited. Then she did something she hadn't done since the funeral. She reached across the table, and took his hand. No hesitation, but no shame, only warmth. They sat like that as the lantern flickered low. Shadows rising on the walls like tall grass in wind. Outside, the air was still, but inside, there was breath. The next morning, she took him to the edge of the ridge, where the trees opened into wildflower fields, where the wind ran free and unapologetic. She pointed. "There," she said. "That's where I want to build." He looked at her, surprised. A second cabin. She nodded. No ghosts, no fire scars, just us. He didn't answer. He just kissed her forehead, placed the third wolf standing tall at the base of the nearest tree, and whispered, "She lives here now." Later that week, she etched it onto a wooden beam above the cabin door. "She lives here now." No names, just that. Because what mattered wasn't what they were called. It was that they were alive, together, and free, as the sun set behind the ridge, casting their shadows long across the grass. The two of them stood with hands interlocked. No vows, no audience, just wind, wolves, and the soft sound of birds returning to the trees. And for the first time in years, her heart made no sound but peace. Sometimes, salvation doesn't arrive on horseback. It doesn't knock. It doesn't shout. It doesn't come in the form we expect, clean, polite, or dressed in Sunday best. Sometimes, salvation is wild, ragged, silent. It crawls out of the woods with a broken past, a scarred face, and eyes that remember things you've tried to forget. It doesn't promise comfort. It doesn't make apologies. It simply doesn't leave. In life, we often wait for healing to look like joy, but more often, it looks like presence, like someone who stays through the silence, someone who listens without fixing, someone who doesn't flinch at your ruins, but builds something with you among them. This story wasn't about rescuing someone feral. It was about choosing not to look away when the world did, about seeing the spark inside the wreckage and offering it shelter. We are not meant to be tamed. We are meant to be known. So when someone shows up bruised, bent, but not broken and offers you their truth in the form of a hand-carved wolf, don't ask why. Just say, "I see you." And if you're lucky, they might just whisper something only your soul understands.